Kind of a small crowd so far this afternoon. We'll give it another minute or so. All right, I'm going to start the recording. All right, let me get the recording going here. All right, this is the Friday afternoon review session, week 2, the boot camp for DEX for TVB 450, wrong 450 class here. Let me just give you an idea where we're going today, and I'll try to get through the kind of the review content if we can in about an hour and 15 minutes, and ideally leave 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions. There's quite a lot to talk about today, though. Let me get into presentation mode. Excuse me, I'm having a horrible allergy day again here. So I'm once again asked to remind you that the materials are copyrighted. The materials you have are for your use and your use only. And again, I'm reminded to share this forward-looking statement page. Again, what it basically says is, should you be the person making any purchasing decisions about Salesforce, you should make those decisions based on what's currently in the app, not what Salesforce says might be in the app at some point in time down the road. You'll probably hear that 100 more times. Let me just double check one thing here real fast. Yeah, let me, so let's get into the content here. I think I have about 12 slides, something like that. So the things that you talked about are the things you worked through in the Trailhead modules this week sort of fell into 4 categories, or 5 categories rather. The first couple days were all about Process Builder and Flow and how they kind of interacted together. And then the last couple days we're at a pretty high level, just kind of introducing you to some of the general concept about Apex. And then next week will be a little deeper dive into Apex for sure. So this is a slide, slide 54. This is a slide that, depending on how you're taking notes and things like this, I would put an X on this, or I'd write down the slide number or something, because this slide could become actually quite important in the exam, because you should fully expect questions of the nature, we have this use case, here's what we need to accomplish. And what you'll be asked to do is, kind of come up with what would be the automation tools that we would use. So again, what you I would argue the top row is probably the most important. What can we do with Process Builder? We can create a record. It can be a related or an unrelated record. We can update related records. We can update the parent record. We can update the children records. And one of the flow exercise, one of the Process Builder exercises this week had you do that. You can post a chatter. There's a number of different ways that you can post a chatter. You can post to an individual user. I just want to double check something here. I'm hearing some beeps. Yep. Okay. You can post to an individual's chatter page, if you will. You can post, and so it appears on a record. You can post so it appears in a chat or group. There's a number of possibilities there. You can launch what's called an auto-launched flow. Those are sometimes called screenless flows as well, because there cannot be any user interaction in those. You can fire up a quip document. We talked briefly about that last week. You can fire up a sub-process. So one process builder, a process built in Process Builder can call another process built in Process Builder. So you can sort of modularize things. You can submit a record for approval. And approvals was one of the things you talked about this week. There are other ways to submit for approval, but this is an important one. You can fire up what's called a quick action. You can fire off a special formatted Apex class. I think you have an example of that in week 4, if I remember correctly. You can send off an email. There has to be an email template already in existence. Or when they say send a custom notification, what they're really talking about is send what's called a platform event. And again, you'll have some discussion of platform events in a subsequent week as well. So those are the types of things Process Builder can do. You'll notice there's a lot of similarities here between what Flow can do and Process Builder can do. Notice a couple of the differences, though. Flow, for example, can delete records. If perhaps you're passing into into Flow a parent, you can go find the children and delete the children, etc. So you have more flexibility there, and then a number of similar things as well. Workflow, much more constrained. You can assign a task, you can send an email, you can do a field update, or you can do this thing that's called an outbound API message. Again, if you're familiar with integrations, that's a SOAP level API message, or essentially what you have to do when you're configuring that piece of the workflow. You specify what's called an endpoint, and an endpoint is nothing more than a URL. And then ideally, you would have the documentation from the other side of the integration, because that would be where you'd figure out what data do they need, in what order, what order do the fields need to be, and then what happens behind the scenes is Salesforce actually generates what's called an XML package, and then ships that over. So it's an outbound. There's no waiting for a reply. It literally is the only mechanism within Salesforce where you can do any type of integration without having to write code. Any other type of integration will require some code, at least as of now. And then approval processes, these are the actions that are performed typically when you either reject or accept a record, when it's approved or not approved. You can lock or unlock a record. The default behavior is that once a record is approved, it remains locked, which basically means it's read-only. When you cancel a record or when you reject a record, it's automatically unlocked. And then you can assign a task, you can send an email, you can do a field update, you can do an outbound API. So you'll notice, with the exception of the record locked, the actions that can be done by an approval process, good grief, are exactly the same as the actions that can be done in a workflow. Okay, and then the bottom part of this is also kind of important. I just don't like the way they labeled it over here, where they say, when they talk about deployed through. I don't think they're really talking about deployment here. They're talking about how does this particular interaction get invoked or get fired, if you will. How does it get triggered? Deployment usually more means when you're going to move something from a sandbox to a production environment. So what are the mechanisms? How can I attach Process Builder to things? Probably the most typical is that when you're a user anyway, they click the save button, or it'll automatically take that record and pass it through the process. And then depending on the criteria, it'll fire off or not fire off the different actions. That's one record at a time. If you're using the data loader or one of the other kind of mass upload tools, the process fires for every single record. When they say API here, you could have an integration that's passing records to us. And then when you get a little further into the Apex stuff, you'll learn more about DML. DML stands for data manipulation language. Those are the Apex commands that do inserts, updates, etc. They also will cause processes to fire. How do flows get fired? Again, there's multiple ways. Probably one of the most frequent is that you attach the flow to a button or a link on a record. You can create custom buttons, custom links. You can have a flow become a quick action. You can embed flow in a visual force page. You can fire off flow from a process that you build in Process Builder. And then one of them, I think it was the fourth exercise you did in Flow this week, you created a simple little flow, but you had to enable one of the characteristics in your org that said, we're going to allow these flows to be deployed in a Lightning component. And then you went out to the thing that's called the app builder, dragged the concept or dragged the component called flow, and then grabbed the particular flow you just created and you put it on the home tab. That's a very, very frequent and actually one of the easier ways to deploy flow. You can just put it in a component on a record page, a home page, etc. When do workflows get invoked? Notice almost exactly the same. In fact, it is exactly the same as Process Builder. It's typically upon the save of a record. It can also be the update of a record, data loader, etc., etc. How do approval processes get invoked? Until only about a couple years ago, the only way you could do it was a person had to manually click a button called Submit Button. Much more recently than that, you can automate that by having a process invoke an approval process, a process builder from Process Builder. You can have flow invoke an approval process, or you can do it in Apex code as well. So again, for the purposes of the exam, what you want to kind of lock in your head about this page, and actually the next page as well, is what are the capabilities of each of these declarative capabilities, and then be able to answer in the test, given a particular use case, can I do it declaratively? I would almost go so far as to say, and don't hate me for saying this, you should sort of memorize this page. Because this will probably get you 3 or 4 questions on the exam about the capabilities of the declarative stuff. So really important page. And sort of a summary of that on the next slide, if I can get my computer to work there we go. Again, going from left to right, the 4 different types of tools we just talked about. What are the types of actions they perform? Do they do time-based? In other words, very non-technically, I like to think of that as, can we set an alarm clock? And when that alarm clock goes off, then perform the action. The answer is yes in Process Builder. The answer is yes in Flow, because you can delay a flow. And then the answer is yes in Workflow. The answer is no in Approvals. Approvals always just are immediate actions. Can users interact with them? In other words, is there a user interface component to it? The only one of these where the answer is yes is Flow, and that's if it's a screen-based flow. Where can we call Apex code from? Well, I can invoke a method in an Apex class from within a process, from within Flow, not from within Workflow, not from within Approvals. And the only one that out of the box simply I can delete a record is Flow. When they have the parentheses in the first column there, Process Builder processes cannot delete records, but they can invoke a flow that can delete the record. So again, the previous page and this page really do a very nice job at sort of a high level of laying out the capabilities of the declarative tools. And for the purposes of the exam, you really need to know these things. I'm going to pause for a second here. Let me get back to the page here. Anybody have any questions about that? The question, can you elaborate on publish subscribe logic using process flow, how either of these 2 tools are used in platform events? You know what, I'm not going to answer that now, because you're going to cover platform events, if it's not next week, the week after. So I'll go into detail on that when everybody's had a chance to look at that. How do approval processes differ from workflows? Well, approval processes, two ways. They require user interaction. So they can you can automatically dump a record into an approval process, but then it requires a person to actually click on a button that says I approve or reject. They can do that a couple of different ways. You can put buttons on the record. There's a cool little widget that you can put in, like on a home page that shows a person all the records. And then the actions only fire at the point in time the record is approved or rejected. The actions there's no kind of intermediate actions. Delegated approver, exactly what Michelle said. I don't know if you've ever looked at this, but if you go into and look at a user record in your Trailhead org, not the virtual bootcamp org, but the actual Trailhead, you'll actually see that there is a field in there where every user can specify who their delegated approver is. So that if I'm out of town, I can delegate it to that person. So it is something that every individual approver does this. Hello, Greg. Turn off the chat chime. If I knew how to do that, I would. If somebody can tell me how to do that, I'd love to, but I can't find a place to turn it off. So sorry, I don't know how to do that. Approval records also have the ability to lock records. Yes, I mentioned that. And the default is as a record gets put into an approval process, it's locked. When you reject it, it gets unlocked. When you approve it, it remains locked. Because the idea typically is, especially in a true business application, that once a record has been approved, it shouldn't be changed. And locking it makes it unchangeable. By default, it's by anybody but the system administrator. You can tweak it, though, so that it can also be the person who owns the record can also do that. Yeah. I'm clicking on the chat icon on the bottom of my screen. I am in the browser. Sorry, I'm on the browser, so maybe that's why I can't do that. So sorry. I'm in the browser version, not on the installed version, because I have a stupid laptop. All right, cool. Let's move on. Back into the deck here. So the next, and really the rest of the week, after you kind of got through that stuff, was this sort of overview of Apex. And I sort of think of it as like the 500,000 view, maybe the 50,000 views, better to say that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through all of this content in mass, and then I will take questions about the Apex concepts at the end, because I think there's a natural flow to how the presentation should go here. I'm also going to, a couple times during this, branch out of the slides and go to the documentation, because I think there's some things you should see in the documentation as well. All right. So what is Apex? And again, I'm not going to read this to you. It is Salesforce's proprietary object-oriented programming language. It looks an awful lot like Java, and it's particularly intended for, as the first bullet here says, data manipulation. Grab some data from the database, make changes to it, push it back to the database, etc. It works in conjunction, as they say here, with the declarative features. I think it's next week where we're going to talk in great detail about the thing that's called the order of operations. It's a really painful topic, to be honest, but what it does is describe the order in which all of these types of business process stuff happens. When do Apex triggers fire? When do workflows fire? When do validation rules fire, etc.? No, it's all completely predictable, and we'll talk about that a lot. When they say it has access to your org's metadata, well, first of all, we need to make sure everybody understands what Salesforce means by metadata, because if you come, as I do, sort of from a formal computer science background, There, the definition of metadata is data about data. That's not really how Salesforce uses the term metadata. Metadata is how Salesforce saves any customizations you've made to your org. So if you've created a custom object, created custom fields, you created flows, etc. All of those types of things are stored in the background as metadata. To get really geeky on it, they're actually stored as XML files that you know how to get to them, you sort of can. But perhaps the most important of this thing is the last bullet on the page, where it's designed to work effectively and efficiently. I would have said that a little differently had they asked me. You have to write efficient code or your code's going to break. And that's because of this whole multi-tenant environment. And I like to give an example. If this is completely new to you, we talked about multi-tenancy last week a little bit. As developers, at some point in time, we've all coded an infinite loop. Every single one of us has. If that's a chunk of code that's running on my laptop, I just do Control-Alt-Delete and find the process and kill it. If I can't find the process and kill it, I might have to lean on the power button and turn off my computer. But Apex code, if it's in an infinite loop, isn't running on your laptop. It's running in the cloud. It's running on the Salesforce servers. And to prevent you from sucking up more than your fair share, you as a user, your fair share of CPU cycles, Salesforce puts what's called a governor in place. Silly name, it's a limit. So you cannot use what's called more than in what's called a transaction. Again, we'll talk about that as the week goes on, the weeks go on. In that transaction, you can't use more than 10 seconds of CPU time. Now, you can get a lot of computing done in 10 seconds. But if you try to use more than 10 seconds of CPU time, your user will experience what's called an unhandleable exception. And what will happen is they will see a little message in red, the top of their screen that says, an exception has occurred. Please call your system administrator. Again, we'll talk in more detail about governor limits, etc., but you have to program defensively. You have to program that you know those governor limits are not going to be hit. And we'll talk about a whole bunch of the tricks to do that, particularly next week. So yes, it's designed to work effectively and efficiently, but it's our job as developers to write efficient and effective code, or the code blows up. Again, there are what are called unhandleable exceptions. You cannot create an exception handler to kind of deal in real time with these multi-tenant issues. It just busts your code. So lots of words, but that's sort of Apex. Okay, this is a great page. I'm glad they have this in here. I'm going to get my marker going here for a second. What I want to make sure you see here is that what they're really trying to do is show there's sort of two pieces here, above and beyond the yellow. So you as the developer, you're sitting on your laptop using whatever tool it is. It could be Developer Console, it could be Visual Studio, whatever, IDE, integrated development environment you're using. You're coding some Apex. You click on Save, and what happens is it takes that code and sends it to the compiler. The compiler lives in the cloud. If you get any compilation errors, that code is not saved. Instead, you get error message. You cannot save Apex code that has compilation errors. It will not let you do that. But then, once it compiles correctly, it takes that code and actually saves it as metadata. In fact, behind the scenes, friends, there's a couple of special objects in Salesforce, one that's called classes and one that's called triggers. In those classes, every trigger, every Apex class, those objects, every trigger Apex class, it stores its name, it stores its source code, and it stores its compiled version, kind of the runtime version. That's from the developer perspective. But then now let's think about, here I am, the user. And maybe we've got a trigger. We haven't talked about those much yet, but maybe we've got a trigger that's going to run when I save a record. So here I am, the user, type. I click the save button. That request goes up to Salesforce. At that point, Salesforce will pull the compiled code into this thing that's called the application server, the runtime engine, if you will, do whatever it's supposed to do. And if in fact the user is supposed to get a result back, it'll get the result back. If nothing else, the user will be taken from the edit page out to the detail page as that in fact the save completed, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a slightly different environment. The code is compiled in the cloud, it's saved in the cloud, it's executed in the cloud. And I'm going to stop there because there often are questions about that. Whoops. Anybody have any questions on that? Get back into chat here. Get back into chat here. There it is. Anybody on that one? What is the application server? It's the servers in the cloud where the code runs. It's just a big, actually just a big unit. That's where the code actually runs. Michelle, I'm not going to talk about triggers and classes yet. You're going to have a whole bunch of those next week. So hold tight on that. That'll make more sense as we get going here. Yeah, I'm not pushing you off, but I want to cover the stuff that's covered today. And then if we have time at the end, I'd be certainly happy to talk about that more. I'm muting people as fast as I can. People, you got to mute yourselves because I can't be going back and forth and doing the mute all. Please mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go back to a couple more pages here. One of the kind of cool things about the developer console, if you haven't played with it yet, is that it has this capability here that's called, let me get my marker going again, that's called Execute Anonymous. Kind of a dumb name. What it lets you do, though, is just play with little snippets of Apex code that then are not saved. You got to think of them as temporary. As soon as I close the developer console, the execute anonymous code goes away. But if you just need to test a little bit of code, if you just want to do a syntax check on this class, et cetera, it's a great little way to play with it. And then as you run it, if you have this checkbox here, open log checked, when you execute it, when you execute the code that's in the execute anonymous, one of these things called a debug log will fire up. And it will have a step-by-step of everything that happened in the background. Everything you're able to deduce when your validation rule's fired, when your flow's fired, when your trigger's fired, etc. Again, we'll get into the details of that. And then there's a mechanism that you'll see also. I know this is not fair. You'll see it eventually. Where in your Apex code, you can use a special system call that's called system.debug, parentheses. You put a string in there, and that way you can put your own personal messages in a debug log. And you can kind of do that for some tracing, making sure you're understanding how you're getting through your code, etc. So it's just, you'll have a lot of chances to play with this thing called the developer console coming up, particularly next week. All right, let me move on here. Data types, classes, and methods. This is sort of the meat of the day here, or meat of the Thursday, I think it was. So just like all programming languages, Salesforce has a number of data types. What they're calling these on this page are primitives, and that's not an incorrect use of the term primitive, but it's a different use of the term primitive than a lot of other programming languages use. Now, why? And again, I don't want to get in too deep here, but basically each one of these things is in fact a class. So there's behind the scenes, there's a decimal class, there's a long class, there's a string class. And why that's important to know is that for those classes, there are a whole bunch of methods that you can use that will help you manipulate them. So indulge me here. I'm going to get out of the deck here for a second. Pull that away. And I am going to go out to a URL that I really do believe you should have in your favorites if you don't already. And that is the URL developer.salesforce.com. And I happened to land there because that's where I was the last time. But what you want to be aware about here is there's this thing called the Apex Developers Guide. There is a PDF version you can download. It's about, I think, 2,500 pages. You probably don't want to print it. But what I want to show you is a couple of the ways you'll use this documentation. So for example, up here in the search, I'm going to type in the word string class. It'll take a couple seconds. I'm going to go right here, click on string class. And what it will do is sort of give you a definition of, what do they mean by a string, et cetera, et cetera. And then they're showing all these methods that you can apply to a string variable. So for example, if I have a string variable called, X, and I go X dot capitalize, as you see here in the middle, what it's going to return me is that same string with the first letter uppercased. I can center things. I can pad things. I can abbreviate things. There's probably 50 or 60 of these. One that I know I've used several times when I've been doing some development work is this is alpha. Are all the characters in this alphabetic? Because maybe for my use case, if it's not all alphabetic, I have to remove the non-alphabetic characters, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do that for strings. Let me just do another one here to make the point. I'm going to go out here and look for integer class. Again, I'll click on, notice this in several different languages here. If I click on integer class, again, the important thing to see, excuse me, is that there's a few, there's not a lot in this case, but there's some of these string methods. The one, again, that I have used more than once when I was doing development work is this format. So if I have an integer variable and I call integer.format, it actually will return that integer displayed as a string using what's called the locale of the current user. The locale setting of a user defines such things as, for integers anyway, do you want to put commas every 3 places? Do you want to put spaces every 3 places? Do you want to put periods every 3 characters, etc.? And sometimes that's really important to know when you're building a report, for example, and you want the data to be displayed in the format that the user is used to seeing. So integers. I'm just going to do one more because it's another one that I've found handy a couple of times to know it was there. I'm going to look up decimal class. Again, only one language this time. But again, there's a whole bunch of methods here. Again, the formatting's a little different this time, but a whole bunch of methods, there they are, that I can use to, return the absolute value, do a division, format, convert it to an integer, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want you to be aware of this Apex Developers Guide, and that what you can do in that Apex Developers Guide is go out and do a search, get into presentation mode again. I could do blob class, Boolean class, date class, and what it will give you, the fancy term is what are called the instance methods. How do I apply how do I manipulate an instance of a Boolean variable, an instance of a decimal, a single variable, etc. And they're just showing you a couple examples here on the page. So if you haven't spent time in that Apex Developer Guide, I really do encourage you to spend some time. It's huge and it's big and it's messy, but it's got a lot of really valuable information. So primitives. Another type of data that you will use a lot in your Apex code are what Salesforce calls collections. Let me get my pen going here again. There you go. The first of which, they don't actually tell you the name of it here. This thing that's called a list. The thing that's called a list. The closest analogy in a more traditional programming language to a list would be an array, in that it's indexed. Ordered is another way to think about that. And it can have duplicate values. So I can have multiple positions in the list that contain exactly the same content here. So what they're doing in line 1A, again, this is making a forward reference into a couple of the things, into a topic coming up, the concept of an S object. What line 1A is doing is creating what's called an empty list of account S objects. An S object is a variable, essentially, that can hold a record in the database. So account is just the name of the object. I could do a list. If I've got something called order _ C, a custom object, I can create a list of S objects of that custom object as well. So this gives me an empty list. Again, assuming you've got some object-oriented background, what's actually happening here is we're invoking the constructor. And this time the constructor doesn't have any arguments, but nonetheless, we're constructing an empty list. And then they're showing you a couple of the methods, again, that you can apply to lists. So in this particular case, we're putting three things in the list. Add an account called account1, add an account called account2, add an account called account1. This is a zero-based list. So the first account1 would be in position 0. The second account2 would be in position 1. I know that's weird. And the second account1 would be in position 2. It's zero-based array. And then they're also showing you down here that there's a method you can apply to lists to retrieve the value from a particular position. If you put a value that doesn't exist, like right now, if I did accounts.get parens 4, I would generate an exception. It's called a handleable exception because it's basically the array index is out of bounds. And then they're also showing you in line 6 how, in fact, you can reference this thing just as an array with sort of the typical square bracket notation. I don't think you'll find yourself doing that very often because there's other easier ways, particularly to manipulate lists of S objects, and you'll see some examples of those. I think it'll be next week as well. So a list, sort of like an array. I can create what's called a set. So a set is unordered, no duplicates. Let me say that again. A set is unordered, no duplicates. So what's happening in line 1B is we're instantiating or constructing an empty set of strings. Then we're putting the string acme in. Get my finger working here. Then we're putting the string Salesforce in. And then we're putting the string Salesforce in again. You might think that would generate an error because there's no duplicates. It will not generate an error. It's simply not going to have any effect because it will not allow duplicates in that set. And then, again, a couple of the other instance methods you can use. I can do this contains. That'll return me a true or false. So in this particular case, this name.contains par. Would return false because that's not one of the values in the string. And then there's also a size method here that kind of what the name implies. In our case, it would tell us the size is 2. There's also a size method on the lists. So the size of accounts in the first paragraph of code would be 3 in position 0, 1, and 2. And then the one that's a little freaky, a little weird, is what's called a map, the bottom paragraph here. And again, if you have sort of a formal computer science background, you may at some point in time in a data structures class have encountered the concept of what's called a hash table. A hash table, the table kind of conceptually contains 2 columns. The first column is an index. The second column is data. So the way to interpret line 1C here is that we're creating this quote hash table, the map, where the index, come on fingers, the index is going to be of type string. That's column 1 if you want to think of it as a table. And the data type is going to be integers. There cannot be duplicate indices. There can be duplicate values. Again, there cannot be duplicate indices. There can be duplicate values. So again, there is the first line here is constructing an empty map of string integer. And then we're putting a value or an entry in the map where the index is Acme, the value is 200. The index is Salesforce, the value is 400. The index is New Corp, the index is 200. But then you'll notice in line 5C, it's actually referencing an index that we'd already put in. So it's not going to put a new entry in the table. Instead, it's going to override the original value of 200. And now the value associated with Acme will be the 600. And then again, they show you a couple other, excuse me, they show you a couple other of the methods down here. There is a size method, how many elements are in the map. There is a contains key, which returns a true or false. Is this key in the list of keys, if you will? And then there's a get that says, assuming I know that this key exists, return me the value. So in this case, the get Acme would return that value of 600. Right. That's a lot of detail on one page. Again, I guess I will stop here, give you guys a chance to ask questions if you have them. Anything on this here? Let me get back to the chat stuff here.
Hey, Greg, can you explain the 7C again line, please?
Yes, let me just get out to chat and see what other questions are there, but yes, I will. Go. Just double checking here. Just for debugging purposes, if a public method returns something other than void, I think you mean, okay, would it be correct to say that we have to initialize a variable that matches the data type of the method? Well, no, you don't necessarily have to create a data type. You just have to use you don't have to create a variable. You just have to use the result of that call in an appropriate way. It might be stored in a variable, but it doesn't have to be in a variable. Yeah. Can you, I lost it here. Can you have an arbitrary list that stores instances of different objects similar to array list in Java? Negatory, I'm afraid. I don't know what your question here means, Camille. Static, what's that mean? You're talking about static methods? Yeah, I don't know what that means, I'm afraid. If you want to put something in. Sets can't have repeated values, size, yes. Hash table, exactly. All right, I think I've answered them. Other than using loops, is there a way to get all unique field values from a list to a set? No, because you have to. Well, I'm going to say it depends. It depends on what the data type is. If it's a list of S objects, no, because you can have sets of S objects. But if it's a list of strings, I believe you can just cast it. There's the concept of casting from one data type to another. So I think you can do that. I think the question being asked here, let me get back out to the deck, was, yes, line 7C. What I didn't talk about is what, let me get my cursor going again here, kind of a somewhat advanced topic if you're brand new to programming, and it's this, whoops, I missed, sorry, this whole line of code. It's what's called a ternary or tertiary operator. You'll notice that I've got a question mark here. and a colon here. And the way to interpret this is that this has to be a Boolean expression. It has to be something that returns true or false. So if that returns true, this chunk of code is going to execute. If it returns false, this chunk of code. So it's really an inline if then else. It's an inline if then else. If this is true, then this, else this. That's not unique to Apex. That's in C, C++. I think it's in Java and stuff. So, but yeah, it's called a ternary or tertiary operator.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's move on. All right, an Apex class. We could probably spend 2 hours on this page. So what is a class? What is an Apex class? I'm going to answer the question 2 ways. Actually, I'm going to answer the question 3 ways, and then we'll talk about what's actually on the page here. A very typical use of Apex classes in the Salesforce world, or classes in the Salesforce world, is that it will be a container for a bunch of invocable methods. And those methods will all be what are called static methods, meaning you don't have to instantiate the class. So it's really almost in that sense it's as a library of a bunch of related methods. That'll be a very typical use for classes. Another use for classes is for testing. We'll get into testing. I forget if it's next week or the week after. Classes, they have to be specially shaped, specially formatted, but there are what are called test classes. The testing that we'll talk about, depending on your background, you might call it unit testing, you might call it component testing. It's sort of the lowest level of testing. We're not talking about user acceptance test or things like that. This is very, test the individual lines of code almost. And then a third use of classes that we will get into, I think it's week 6. It's either week 5 or week 6. Again, it's sort of a specially formed class that you attach to a Visualforce page. And it can either be what's called a custom controller or a controller extension. Again, very specifically shaped, specifically formatted, declared a particular way. But those are probably the most typical uses of classes. So what does a class then contain? Well, again, I'm going to kind of keep it simple for this page right now. What the class can contain are data declarations, or if you want to put it in Java terms, these are the class attributes, or even JavaScript terms. These are the class attributes. So we're going to have something called a member variable, a member property, etc. Putting this get and set on here again might not make sense until we get to Visualforce. But what that's giving us is both what's called a getter and a setter. That makes it really easy to move the value that's in this variable called member property to a Visualforce page, set it to the page, as they say, and then get it to the page as well, where you kind of pull it into the page. If you are going to be creating classes that are going to be in the traditional object-oriented flavor, where it represents some type of real-world entity, it's often used for modeling, if you will. You may then find yourself creating a class, or a method in the class, rather, and notice that this method shares the name of the class. That means that this method is what's called a constructor. When you instantiate the class to generate an object from the class, the constructor can do stuff. And often what the constructor does is initialize the properties in the class. And then there are just this is the kind of typical method. We'd be able to invoke this method. What they're calling method logic here would probably be doing something to these variables, depending on what the use case is. So think of a class as a container. That container can contain 3 different types of things almost always. It can contain data declarations, not unlike what you see in lines 2 and 5. It can contain 1 or more constructors, not unlike what you see in lines 6 and 9. And then it'll contain some number of methods. That's usually where the meat of the class is. That's where the work is actually getting done. All right, let me go right to the next page because this is important. This is another one of those pages that, for the purposes of the exam, I would say please memorize. And I'm really not being facetious there at all. There are different attributes and what they call modifiers you can apply to classes and the members in classes, and which ones you use will sort of dictate how that class can be used and how what's within that class can be used. So what I want to do is give you an example of each one of these, and then you'll probably want to spend some time in the documentation really digging into even more detail, because again, this is a slide we could easily spend an hour on. So when might I want to have a class rather than declared public like it was on the previous slide? It's declared global. Well, what that means is that at least one of the methods in that class is going to be made visible to the outside world as a web service. So an outside system can make a call into Salesforce and get some work done on our behalf. What that also means is that any method within that class would have to be declared as global as well. So again, if you're building a class that's going to be receiving an inbound integration request, an inbound call, the class has to be global, and the method that you're invoking from that Java system or whatever system sitting out there has to be global as well. Public, what that, again, they've got some fancy schmancy words here. What it basically means is that it's available within your org. So if I create a public class with some public methods in it, any other Apex code I write, be it another class or be it a trigger, can invoke that method within that class. So it's really how we build up the library of Apex code that's going to be used within our org itself and not from the outside world. I very much doubt that you'll ever use protected. Again, if you come from a kind of a detailed object-oriented programming background, in a more traditional OO language, you can have nested classes like any levels deep. You can do nested classes in Apex, which you can only go one level deep. And what that does is that you have the ability then to basically protect methods so that they're only available to that inner class. They're not available to other Apex code outside that class. That's what protected means. And then if you make either a method or, well, first of all, you're very seldom going to make a method private unless it's for testing. Very, very seldom unless it's for testing. If you make an attribute private, it means it's not visible to the outside world. If you make a method private, it means it's not visible to other Apex code outside that class. And the idea is within one class, you might have a bunch of helper methods, and those helper methods are going to be called from the primary methods. So the helper methods would be designated as private because the outside world can't invoke those. Other Apex code can't invoke those. Again, there's a lot of detail on this page. I very much encourage you to dig into the documentation. They have lists of all the different use cases where you would see these, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm, again, going to stop for a second. Let me, oops, come on, fingers. And let people have questions or ask questions if they have them. Let me get back here. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, Parker, but accessors and mutators it's not the terminology used in Salesforce, so it is going to be getters and setters. You will not see those terms in any of the Salesforce documentation. Yeah, the getters and setters automatically create simple getters and setters. You can get more complex than that. They apply to visual force pages usually. Let me see what else is here. Yeah, Andrew, when we get into the visual force stuff, we'll get much more into getters and setters. So don't worry about that too much. Can we call a class from Process Builder? Yes. But what you can do from Process Builder is invoke what's called a static method. So you don't instantiate the class, you invoke a static method within the class. Yeah, and again, I think we have an example of that later on. If not, I know there's a trailhead that has you do that. Just do a search for that. You should be able to find that. Yeah, okay. Anything else before we move on? We're having more fun than ought to be allowed on Friday afternoon. All right, so Raja, we're going to talk about static variables when we get into the order of operations, because they do not behave the same in Apex as they behave in a more traditional OO language like Java, etc. Yeah, let me see. More on static versus instantiate. Yeah, I can do quickly on that. Let me go back here into my deck. And let me actually go to, well, yeah, let's just look at this example. This example might help answer some of the questions. So in this particular example, we have a public class. It has one public method. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It has one public method, but notice what it also has in it, excuse me, is a private method. So the idea is this method, let me get my highlighter going here. This method that's called send email is invoking this inspect results. If I have another Apex class someplace or other, it cannot invoke this method called inspect results because it's private to the class, but another method within the class can invoke it. All right, so that's the concept of private here. It's a helper method. It's, in this case, it's helping the method send mail. Inspect results is helping the method called send mail. Yeah, and what it's doing is really kind of cool. It's using some default messaging here, how you can send emails and things like that. All right, I think there's one more page that'll help here as well. The word static is used in a couple of different ways in Apex. When you use static in conjunction with the word final, as they are here, in terms of creating some variables, it means they're constants. It means they can only be initialized once, is another way to think about that. So, excuse me, this, sorry, good grief. I'm so sorry. This is a final variable. And again, what they're trying to show you here is there's all sorts of funky ways that you can initialize these. Notice that this is actually a reference to this guy down here. So take a second to look at this, and what you'll notice is that this is the constructor for this class. So when we would instantiate that class, when we'd create an instance of that class, it would automatically be assigning this variable, this final var, to the value 1. You can only do it once. You can hard code it. They're doing that. But the difference here with the final var 1 and final var 2, is that I can actually change those values. It's just that I'm initializing them at the beginning. The static ones, I can't make any changes to them. Again, static means something different in this world here. So in this case, you'll notice what we're using for line 4, this thing called static final var 3. We're using what's called a static block. This is not unique to Apex, but it's a little chunk of code that will run at the point in time the class is instantiated, but it's not the constructor. All it's doing is assigning the value of 3 into that static variable. And then we can also hard code into that static variable as well. All right, again, we'll talk more about static when we get into the order of execution, because that's when it really comes to play. All right, let me stop here. Again, any questions on any of that? Get out into the old chatter here. Wrong spot, Greg. Come on. My fingers have stopped working. There we go. Repeat the example on helper classes. Okay, did that. Is not instantiating it like putting a label on a box, but not filling the box. Sort of. The constructor could actually fill the box, though. Yeah. So yeah, if you don't do anything in the constructor, I don't disagree. You sort of got an empty box, but the constructor could then put things in the box. I get. Michelle, when you say something like this, what do you mean? I don't know what the this is referring to. Again, I keep putting it off. We'll talk about static variables when we get to the order of execution, because that's where they come into play. Static variables are frequently used to control what's called recursion. Recursion within a method calling a method calling a method, getting recursion. Workflows can actually recurse, processes can recurse. And it's often the case that you'll have a static variable of type Boolean that you'll set to true at some point in time, and that will sort of stop the recursion. And we'll talk about that later on in the week. Yeah. Definitely going to rewatch this. Yeah, this is some tough stuff. This is tough stuff. You know, while I'm gonna take a time out here for just a second. I'm gonna make a pitch for a book that I like a lot. You can get it in places other than Amazon. It's just where I know I can find it out there. There it is. If you're new to object-oriented programming completely, I love this book. That's called The Object-Oriented Thought Process. It's been around forever. It's in the 5th edition. I've actually taught a couple college classes using this as the textbook. It's language generic. What they use is, sort of looks like Java, but it's an amazing book that starts very simple and walks you through all the different possible concept of object-oriented programming, why it's used, what's the history of it, etc. As a hardcore developer, I think it should be in your library. You can get used ones for $30 or so. So really, really, really like that book. Yes, if they're public. When private, only within the class. Exactly. Is any edition okay? I would get the most recent. I'd get version 5 because it's been updated a lot. I taught out of both version 3 and 4, but now I have version 5 in my library, so I would get the most recent one. Yep. It's hard stuff. All right, let me go back. We got a little less than half an hour. For documentation on the Salesforce API? Yeah. We're going to go right to where we were a while ago. I'm going to go to developer. Come on, Greg. Developer.salesforce.com. I'm going to go to docs. Come on, docs. There we go. And search for APIs. And there's all sorts of documentation on using the Salesforce APIs. And some of them are, cloud specific. Some of them are not. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there. The APIs. All right, we need to probably move on here. We're going to run out of time if we don't. I think some of these next slides will go a little more quickly. What are the flow of control statements? So these are very traditional for almost any programming language. The idea here is what they've done is they've created a list of integers. Then they're declaring a variable into which they're assigning the size of that list. So the size would be, the size would be 3 in position 0, 1, and 2. And then they're showing us 3 different ways I could iterate over that list. I will be very, very honest with you. I have a feeling you will very seldom use anything other than the one at the bottom. That's a horrible arrow, Greg, because it fits into the nature of how lists are used in Salesforce. But let's start at the top. The idea is you can do a while loop. And again, this is traditional programming stuff. In a while loop, the condition is at the top of the loop, which means you could potentially enter the loop 0 times. So they've set iterator to 0. We enter the loop because iterator is definitely less than 3. It'll pull out the 0th position and put it in this debug log. Then it'll increment iterator. This is the plus plus. Iterator plus plus, if you haven't seen it before, is equivalent to iterator is assigned iterator plus 1. It's just a shorthand. Again, that's not unique to Apex. And then it'll go get the second, what's in the first position. Then it'll go get what's in the third position. It would then increment to 3 the last pass through the loop, which would cause the condition to be false. Drop out of the loop. We've iterated through all 3. A more traditional for loop, again, you probably won't use this very often, but you can. The issue with the traditional for loop is that you're sort of required to reference the list as an array. But it works. So again, we're setting iterator to 0. Iterator, that's our initialization. Our loop condition is iterator less than the number of the size, which is 3, and then we iterate after the loop. So iterator set to 0. Yes, it's less than 3. Enter the loop. Do this. Once we've grabbed the 0th position, increment, and then go back and do it again here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very traditional for. Again, the one at the bottom is the one I'm going to guess you will use almost all the time. And it's what's called, I call it a for next statement or for each statement. So the idea is we've got a for loop in which we declare an iteration variable. So in this case, the iteration variable is going to be I. And the way I like to read this for loop is for every I in 3 numbers, and remember 3 numbers is our list, dump out that I. So what's going to happen is it's going to start with I pointing here. It would dump out the value 1. And then it would move I to the next position in the list, and then it would move I to the next position in the list. It will work if we have 0 elements in the list. It'll work if we have 147 elements in the list, or if we have 2,000 elements in the list. And I don't need to worry about knowing what the size is. So it's just iterating over them, and in a sense, returning the elements in the list one at a time via this iteration variable that they called I. So again, you'll see lots of examples of those. We'll see examples where we do a for loop where we're iterating over the result of a SOCL query, for example. Multiple cases where we'll iterate over lists as we're doing some type of processing. And again, very seldom will you use these, I think, because this is just a natural way to do it. And it actually saves you a little memory. I don't have to have this variable here or let's call to this method to determine how big it is. It's just automatically done for me. All right, conditions, loops, etc. S objects. So just about bring us up to our time here. So they got awfully technical here at the top. An S object is a generic abstract type. All right, let's keep it simple. If we look at line 1A here, what we're doing, the way to think about it is we're instantiating an S object. The ACCT is the S object of type account. So what ACCT, what that variable is going to look like sort of conceptually is a row in the account database table. I'll say that again. What ACCT here is going to look like sort of conceptually is a row in the account database table, in the account object, if you will. And then we're saying instantiate it. So as I forget who said a while ago, if I didn't do this, if that name equals Acme wasn't there, it would just be an empty S object. It would exist, but it would be an empty S object. But what we're doing here is invoking the constructor, and we're saying, hey, I know there's a field on the account that's called name. In this S object, I want you to put Acme in that field. So I could actually have a comma delimited list here of all the different fields in the account record, and I'm therefore not generating an empty account, if you will, an empty account S object. I'm generating an account S object that in our case has one value in it, has the value of Acme in the name field. And then we haven't talked about it yet, but this is then a DML operation. Insert this in the database. That would have the impact of creating a new record in the database in the account object that would have the name Acme. All the other fields would be null. All the other fields would be null. And then what they're showing you at the bottom here is it's really sort of the same concept, but you can reference the custom objects as well. So again, don't worry too much about what this code is doing, but you'll notice what we've got here is a method. Now, they didn't show us the class that it's contained in. Excuse me. They're showing us a method. What this method expects as its one argument is a list of S objects of type offer _ C, and our parameter variable or our argument, whatever term you want to use, is called offer list. Let me say that again. So what this method called update offers is expecting is a list of S objects of type offer _ C, meaning it's a custom object, and we're going to be handed that data in a variable called offer list. And then what we're doing here is just iterating through it. In particular, I'm not even going to worry about line 2b right now, but what I want you to notice here is that what we're doing is just going in here and messing around with it. So it says, I'm going to iterate over offer list. Excuse me. I'm going to iterate over offer list. And for every element in offer list, I'm actually going to change the value of the type field to be residential, and I'm going to change the close date to today's date plus 45 days. And actually, as I'm looking at it here, folks,
they forgot to add
there's an error in this
yes.
page, guys. There's an error in this page. Blow away those two lines, not necessary. Blow away 2b and 8b, not necessary. Actually,
no, they forgot to add like, they put that in that list. They need to put.
No, hold on. No. What they needed to do, this is really bad code. I will put an error. I'll log a case on it. What they should have here for the update is update offer list, because they're actually making changes within offer list. So we then need to pop those back out to the database. So blow away line 2C, and what 2B rather, and what 8B should be is update offer list, not update list to update. I will log a case on that because that is wrong. So we're manipulating this list, changing it, and then shoving the new copy of the updated copy of the list out to the database, updating those already existing records. I will log a bug on that. All right, let me get out of here. I'm stop here for now. Let me go answer questions if we have them. Come on, fingers. Here we go. That wasn't a trigger, though, Raja. That's the point. It was a method in a class, so it's not a trigger. Any loops in Apex? We'll find out there. Are there other loops? Well, they didn't do an example of one of them, but there are while loops, there are do while loops, and there are for loops, and that's it. When would the triple equal sign be used? Yes. So, for example, if I have two S objects in memory, two S object variables, and I want to ask the question, do these two S objects contain the same data in every field? I would do S object 1 triple equal sign S object 2, because it's what I call a deeper, kind of a deeper equality. It's looking at every single field in those two S objects. Yeah, I don't know what you're meaning here, only if it's a before trigger, Vicus, because what we were looking at wasn't a trigger. So we weren't looking at a trigger. We were looking at a method in a class. If we create a list of S objects and we store different types in the same list, no. A list is uni. It has to be all the same data type, all the same S object type, or all integer, all string, etc. And that's also the case for maps. If the map has as its data type account, they all have to be accounts. That's one of the foibles of lists. There are concepts, like you say, in other programming languages, but not this one. What are we doing here? Did I miss it? Iterating through a map looks, yeah. No, we didn't show an iteration through a map, and there is no for loop really that goes through a map. Again, a little beyond where we are right now is how I would do that. But what you'd have to do, basically, there's a mechanism where you can pull all of the keys out of a map. You can then iterate through the keys and then use the keys to find the data. But there is no iteration through a map specifically. It just doesn't exist. Anything else? This is a hard week. And I'd say it's particularly hard if you're not already an object-oriented programmer. So if you don't have experience in OO in some language, you're definitely going to hit a wall in missing some fundamental concepts. I'm being kind of blunt here, but yeah, you should spend some time getting that going a little bit here. Map, and the map is not in the order you put it in. That's not quite true. It'll put them in the map the order that you specify them, but you still can't iterate through it. It is the case that if I put 3 elements in the map, it comes out that they'll be in those positions, but you just can't iterate through them. Apex is nice. It does have its challenges. Same with every programming language. But this one has some challenges that are unique to the platform. Let's put it that way. All right, so let's do this. And that'll about bring us to the end of our time here. We have some review questions here we could take a couple minutes and do. And I'm not real fond of these at all. I'm reading them myself. These are really horrible questions. I'm just going to say that because we haven't talked about some of the stuff we need to talk about yet, particularly for numbers 3 and 4. I just did 5. I just talked about 5 is the comparing 2 S objects with a triple equal. And which keyword indicates a variable and can only be assigned at declaration or in the class's constructors. That's that final. Yeah. I don't like questions 3 and 4 because they're not really telling you enough information for you to answer them. Yeah, I don't like those 2 questions at all. So, all right, I'm hearing some beeping here. Let me go back. I haven't been able to get an answer on stage. Evidently, it's new in this release, and the documentation on it is lacking. It's still on my list. I will keep looking, but I haven't found anything meaningful yet. Yeah, I think it's like a path, but I'm not sure. It's just not obvious, so I will look at it. This okay, cool. There's an article on it. All right, let me pull it up, pull it open. Slowly but surely. Come on. Oh, yeah. So it's this yeah. So it's really just I think a fancy pick list ultimately that either we could set through the flow code or the user could indicate that they just finished a stage or something, and you could pop that out to the database. And yeah, interesting, because that the stage is also the word they use for the set of statuses that an opportunity goes through. So I guess that's interesting. Okay. Hey Greg, about flows. Haven't we get already auto launch flows when a record updates? I remember reading. I don't know what we have not done any auto launch flows in this so far in this session. An auto launch flow is a flow you invoke from a process.
Auto launch flows were last released. They also just put out release notes a couple of days on a whole bunch of new features coming to.
I can't hear you. Sorry, a little louder.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that auto launch flows are a thing from last release, and next release they're putting out a whole bunch of new flow updates, including
right. I mean, auto launch flow has been around for a couple years, honestly. But yeah, I know there's new functionality coming. But an auto launch flow is a flow that's invoked from a process. So it could be when a record is changed, the process detects that and then poof, clicks off the auto launch flows. Yeah. I don't think we have had an example of that. I'm not sure you do. You don't need process anymore. Cool. Record triggered flows. Cool. That's new to me. Is it this release? Cool. Cool. Okay. I will look it up. They change it faster than I can keep track of it. What else, my friends? Yeah, flow's getting very powerful this next release, for sure. Less and less code necessary. Yep. Cool. I will look into that. What else, friends? All right. Well, I'll stick around for a while if anybody else has any, individual or private questions. Otherwise, we're going to wrap it here since we seem to be running out of questions. But this is a hard week. Let me remind myself what next week is before I do let you go here. Yeah, phooey. Week 3. Yeah, some tough stuff this next week as well. You're going to be dealing with some SOCL, a little. I don't think you do SOCL yet. And then a lot of what you're going to be doing is reading this next week, as opposed to doing Trailhead modules. This first one for day 1 is a long module. This Apex and database, that's where you'll learn a bunch of stuff in SOCL and things like that. So, I think you have the last 3 to do. So you're a little bit of DML, a little bit of SOCL, a little bit of SOCL in there. So those are non-trivial. Again, particularly if you haven't had experience in query languages before. You will be experiencing loops, the for each or for next loop, particularly in terms of how you handle the results from a SOCL and SOCL query. I think that will be interesting. So we'll be talking about that next week for sure. All right. Any questions, comments?
Hey Greg, hi. I have a question regarding a multi-select. I think I asked you. Suppose if can we use Process Builder to update a multi-select field?
Yeah, but it's just treated as a text field, I believe.
Okay,
yeah.
No, my question here is suppose there is a multi-select field on a parent object and you select one of the field or multiple and you are updating a multi-select field. Can you update a multi-select field in the child object also?
Okay, I kind of got lost in that. I'm going to repeat. No, I'm going to repeat. Let me repeat it back.
Okay.
Can you update? Let me finish. Can you update a child multi-select pick list when the parent has been changed?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why not. Have you found you're not able to? Is that what you're asking the question? Or?
Yes, I have not been able to find a solution for a multi-select pick list.
It meaning the field is simply not available.
No, so based on what value you select on a parent object field is also a multi-select. So,
I tested it and it's not working. It doesn't work properly on multi-select.
Okay. Let him finish what he's saying, though, please. Let him finish. Go ahead.
So, for example, there is a multi-select field on a parent object, and there is a multi-select field on a child object also. So, based on what value you select on a parent object, you want to update the same value on the child object.
Okay, so I'm going to be very blunt here and say you've got a configuration issue. Rather than creating the multi-select on the child object, I would say you should have created a cross-object formula field so that whenever you change the value in the parent, it's automatically changed in the child. You don't even have to have a process do it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that is my option. I have not started the design. I was thinking, is there a way, or I know about the formula.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it was Craig said, avoid multi-select like the plague. Yeah, unless you really need them, don't use them.
Okay.
Because they're handled differently behind the scenes than single select pick lists are. And they're a pain in the butt because all you get handed is a common delimited string of the values, and you have to parse through them to figure out what the values are. So yeah, I would, if there's a way around it, I wouldn't do that.
Okay.
Bill asked the question, can you explain the difference between with sharing and without sharing? Again, that's quite a long answer, but the heart of the answer is Apex code by default runs in what's called system mode. System mode means it runs as if it's a system administrator running the code. And what that means is it ignores all your permissions. It ignores object level permissions, excuse me, field level permissions. It ignores all your sharing. It's like the system administrator is running it. If you tag a class with sharing, and this is some of the stuff you'll get into this next week. If you tag a class with sharing, it's still going to by default ignore object and field level security, kind of the profile security stuff, but it will then pay attention to things like the organizational-wide defaults, role hierarchy, sharing rules, manual sharing, etc. So you have the ability to toggle that off and on depending on what level of access your code needs to have to data behind the scenes. Yeah. All right. Yes. Craig, what do you mean by junction objects here? Use them instead of multi-select pick list? I don't quite see how that would work, but okay.
Yeah, you can generally use a junction object to get a multi-relationship compared to a multi-select pick list. They're just a freaking data nightmare. So it's good.
They are. They're horrible. They're horrible. They're absolutely dreadful. I agree. I love this, Dawn. Multi-select, why admins drink. That's awesome. It's Friday afternoon, too. Well, you shouldn't hate custom objects because they have really important benefits because they are what eliminate many-to-many relationships. So you're going to have them. And they have some nuances to them. So, yep, true story. I don't believe it. Anything else, my friends? Okay, so next week's a hard week. And again, if you don't have a lot of kind of object-oriented background, what I would suggest you do is maybe take your study time on Monday and Tuesday and really dig into just some of those hardcore object-oriented concepts. And then do, you know, the stuff that's specific for this course, perhaps Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or, you know, whatever works into your schedule. Because again, I'm not trying to scare people here, but if you don't have a pretty good grasp of fundamental object-oriented principles, a lot of the stuff that's going to be talked about when we start getting into this next week, Apex Code, and then further on when we get into visual force pages and stuff, it's going to be hard. So I really, really think, good, Andrew posted it. Yeah, it's a great book. It really is. And it's, you know, $35. So. All right, friends. Well, that's the end of our time. Any other questions before we wrap it up? All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. And one more point, and I'll let you go. There were a couple cases logged this week. You're going to run into a 404 error in one of the links they give you this next week. It's being fixed even as we talk. And then the other question, I forget who it was, put in a case, is really talking about how can we keep track of what's being executed between workflows and processes and all that kind of stuff. We will talk about that a lot when we get into the order of execution stuff. So I haven't particularly responded to the case, but we will talk about that. I will go to Amazon again and put that book up one more time for people that want to see it. And then we'll get out of here in a couple minutes. Oh, didn't go far enough. Object or E. There we go. This is the one. The Object-Oriented Thought Process by Matt Weisfeld. It's a great book. All right, folks, I'm going to cancel out of the meeting here. I'll be watching cases Monday and Tuesday. If you have anything, feel free. Otherwise, we will talk on Wednesday. Have a good weekend, everybody. Take care.